Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order when you check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Sports Pictorium Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. If he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL helmet poster. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1.
They are the only team in the history of football to win a championship in 3 different cities. In 1999, the St. Louis Rams defeated the Tennessee Titans. In 1951, as the Los Angeles Rams, they defeated the Cleveland Browns. And in 1945, as the Cleveland Rams, they defeated the Washington Redskins. Next, on Sports Forgotten Heroes, a look back on where it all began for the Rams, Cleveland.
This is Sports Forgotten Heroes, a tribute to the stars who shaped the games we love to watch and the games we love to play. Stars who provided us with many thrills, but when their time was up, they faded away. We'll take a look back at their spectacular careers, their moments of fame, even if it was just for one season or just one game. And now, here's your host, Warren Rogan.
Welcome back to Sports Forgotten Heroes. As always, so glad you can join me as we take a look back at the stars who played the games we love to watch. But not only will we look back on forgotten heroes, over the course of time we will also look back on forgotten teams and forgotten leagues. And in this, the 80th anniversary of the Rams joining the NFL, we take a look back at where it all started for this team, Cleveland. Many teams have relocated, and some might actually surprise you. In fact, did you know that the original Baltimore Orioles moved to New York and became the Yankees? Or that the Kansas City Chiefs were originally the Dallas Texans? The Los Angeles Lakers, they were first the Minneapolis Lakers. And the New Jersey Devils moved to the Garden State after spending time in Colorado as the Colorado Rockies after first being known as the Kansas City Scouts. Yes, many teams have moved and changed names. Of course, Cleveland remembers well when the Browns left for Baltimore. And the fans of the Browns were none too happy. But when the Rams left Cleveland, it was almost unnoticed, almost welcomed. The Rams really never caught on in Cleveland. Attracting fans was always a struggle, and there were many reasons for this. And joining the podcast shortly to talk about the Cleveland Rams will be Jim Sulecki, author of the recently released book, The Cleveland Rams, the NFL Champs Who Left Too Soon. For more information about Sports Forgotten Heroes and the Cleveland Rams, please visit sportsfh.com. I have links there to video of the Cleveland Rams, stats, and more. You can also listen to past podcasts, find out more information on all of my guests, see what podcasts are coming up, and learn how to support Sports Forgotten Heroes. Speaking of which, thanks to Henry R. and Jack K. for their continued support. Follow Sports Forgotten Heroes on Twitter at SportsFHeroes, or search for the Sports Forgotten Heroes page on Facebook. You know, the Rams played their first year of football in 1936 in the original AFL, not the one that merged with the NFL. They joined the NFL in 1937 and remained in Cleveland through the 1945 season before moving to Los Angeles. But most in Cleveland didn't miss the Rams because they were immediately replaced by a championship caliber team from the AAFC, the All-American Football Conference, the Cleveland Browns. But the story of the Rams is a fascinating one, and here to tell us more is Jim Sulecki.
Thank you, Warren. Great to be on.
Hey, so let's start here. Many football fans are quite aware of the fact that the Rams moved last year from St. Louis to Los Angeles. And prior to that, they moved from Los Angeles to St. Louis. But very few know that the first time, there was a first time that they moved to Los Angeles, it was from Cleveland. Yes, the Rams used to be the Cleveland Rams. Tell us about that first move and just how underhanded It really was.
Well, it's interesting because Daniel F. Reeves was the man who bought the Rams in 1941. The Rams had actually begun as a locally owned team in Cleveland by a whole coalition of local sort of sportsmen and lawyers and businessmen. And when the war approached in the early 1940s, this collection of owners began to become very concerned about the fact that the war might actually end operations of the NFL, and that they might then, and they might lose their investments in the team if they did not play their games. So Dan Reeves came in, and he came from a wealthy family from New York City. Was obviously from outside of Cleveland. He had designs on owning an NFL team for quite some time, and had actually attempted to buy the Pittsburgh Steelers, had attempted to buy the Philadelphia Eagles, and was repulsed on both attempts. Yeah, and then when he bought the Rams, he immediately, and this was within 24 hours, the rumors swirled that he was going to move the Rams to Boston, and because the Rams had just not been drawing very well in Cleveland. And all the city fathers pretty much prevailed upon him. No, you have to keep the team in Cleveland. They were really trying to get an NFL franchise established in Cleveland, which may be hard to believe now. NFL is considered to be pretty healthy in the Cleveland market,
sure,
in spite of the performance of recent years. But they tried to keep the team there, and the owners as well. The other owners were against the Rams moving out of Cleveland. So, but Dan Reeves always sort of had in the back of his mind, that he, right from the start, that he was not necessarily long for Cleveland. And so through the early 40s, 42, 43, 44, as he owned the team, he had always kind of cast an eye on California, and then he hired, of course, a general manager named Chili Walsh, who was from Hollywood, went to Hollywood High School. He had a coach who was his brother, and he was also from Hollywood, California. And then he got the quarterback in Bob Waterfield, who was, of course, from California. So as we got into 44, 45, the rumors began to swirl yet again that the Rams are going to move. And through it all, Dan Reeves, the owner, said, no, there's no way. I'm not going to move the team from Cleveland. Chili Walsh, the general manager, said the same thing. About a year practically to the day before the Rams announced they're going to move, he assured local reporters, no, we have a lease on League Park, which is where the Rams played when they weren't playing at Cleveland Stadium. And then, indeed, 4 days before the Rams even announced that they were going to move, and they got permission from the NFL at the NFL owners meeting in January of 1946. 4 days before that, Dan Reeves told Bob Yonkers, who was a reporter for the Cleveland Press, he said, the Rams will definitely stay in Cleveland. And then, as I mentioned, 4 days later, the NFL voted to allow them to move. And the day after that, they announced they were moving. It was in the New York Times, and that was it. And the Rams were gone, just like that. So it's a thing that, it may sound familiar to modern day fans, is that they're getting reassurances from the owners that, oh no, we would never move. But it absolutely was happening behind the scenes, and so in that respect, it was a little underhanded for sure.
And here they had just won the NFL championship, and they moved. And by the way, they're the only franchise in football to have won a championship in 3 different cities. The relationship between the city of Cleveland and the Rams never appeared to be a solid one. Why was that?
Well, first of all, you're talking about a whole lot of losing, through that. The Rams had 8 NFL seasons in Cleveland. Only in one of them was it a winning season, and it was in that championship season in 1945. They had won 500 season in 1939. So there was just a whole lot of losing there. Not a surprise. It was an expansion team, and particularly back in those days, attendance was yoked pretty much to winning, and winning was yoked to attendance, because the owners really relied on that attendance to have the payroll to be able to sign and pay their players. But at the same time, you couldn't get the players if you didn't have the attendance. So and the attendance without the players. So they got kind of in this vicious circle. So losing for sure. The other is that there was a lot of competition from from other sports back then. I mean, people don't realize this, but NFL football was certainly nothing what it is today. Baseball reigned supreme in sports in those days, particularly in Cleveland and in other cities like Boston. Boxing was big back in those days. So you had just a competition with other sports, college football. There was a very unbalanced schedule. The NFL back in those days did not play 8 games, at home, 8 games on the road. It had a schedule that very much favored the kind of the power teams, who at the time were the New York Giants, the Green Bay Packers, the Chicago Bears. So the Rams played in their NFL schedule while they were in Cleveland. They played only about 43% of their games actually in Cleveland. The rest were road games, and that was the only franchise that exceeded them, and that was the Chicago Cardinals, who played only 37% of their games at home, as they're sharing a market with the Bears. And I think it's interesting that those two teams that were the most on the road of that era, of course, are the two teams that have moved the most, right? I mean, the Rams have been in 3 different cities, and of course, the Cardinals have been in 3 different cities. So it's almost like that sort of itinerariness, was kind of built into them, both teams right from the start. And then lastly, it was, Cleveland Stadium, as we know, later when the Browns played there, Cleveland Stadium was no prize of a venue to see a game. So that was another thing. So you kind of had these confluence of all these factors that kind of, that's just kind of worked against the Rams when they were in Cleveland.
Why did the NFL have such an unbalanced schedule? Wouldn't it work to their advantage to let some of the marquee teams play in each city? It was. How did that schedule come about?
I think they were just playing to where they knew that there was going to be attendance. So they, obviously they're going to load up as much as possible. For instance, in New York, the Giants played, like an incredibly high number of games at home. Just because it's a much larger market, and the Giants were a marquee team. Then you had ballparks, in Green Bay, which maybe not as big of a market, obviously, but the team that routinely won. So I think the NFL, they were bootstrapping it in the 30s. They were just trying to get money wherever they could get it, and they just kind of went where the money was. And so when you have an up-and-coming team, even though Cleveland at the time was a larger market, but we have an up-and-coming team that's just not drawing very well, they're going to move those games to stadiums and to cities where they have much more of a guaranteed gate.
And the NFL really wanted a team to succeed in Cleveland. So let's go back to the beginning. After a few failures in trying to establish a foothold in Cleveland, the NFL approved a new team in 1936. Tell me about how the Rams came to be and their early years in the original AFL.
Yeah, that was interesting because you had a guy whose name was Buzz Wetzel, and as I note in the book, here's a guy who is really kind of lost to history. The Rams are kind of thought to be the creation of a lawyer named Homer Marshman. But it was really Buzz Wetzel, Damon Buzz Wetzel, who played at Ohio State, was a star for Ohio State. He was the son of a baseball scout for the Cleveland Indians. So Buzz Wetzel got out of college and played a little bit of football. He played for the Bears on the same team actually as Bronco Nagurski. Played for a little bit with the then Pittsburgh Pirates, now the Pittsburgh Steelers. But really what he wanted was, after one season of playing, he really wanted to run a franchise. It's like he had sports management in his blood, literally. So he got an idea they wanted to start a franchise. The NFL, being very tight-knit at the time, didn't really get much entree there. So he got an idea to get a franchise going in the American Football League, which was kind of starting up. And so he managed to convince Homer Marshman and some other money men in Cleveland to finance this team to go into the American Football League. And it's kind of an interesting story how the team was named was really the team had gotten going, and they said, well, geez, I guess we need a name now. And it was Buzz Wetzel, it was Homer Marshman, and it was 2 sports writers who were there. One of whom was John Dietrich, who covered the Rams literally from the beginning to the end of their time in Cleveland. And that's where I relied a lot on John Dietrich's accounts for what's in the book. But they said, we need a name, so what do we call the team? And Buzz Wetzel said, well, I've always been a fan of the Fordham Rams, who were then very big, very powerful. They had quite a few stars on the team at the time.
Right.
And so I was like the Rams, and then the two sports writers weighed in and said, well, yeah, we like that too, because a 4-letter name like that'll fit perfectly in a headline. and that was it. So that's how the team came about. So they had an interesting first year in the AFL. They became almost antagonists with another team called the Boston Shamrocks, and there was a link between Homer Marshman of the Rams and the owner of the Boston Shamrocks, whose name is Paul Thurlow. The two of them had gone to law school together at Harvard. So as it turns out, at the end of the season, the Boston Shamrocks are just barely ahead of the Rams in the AFL standings. And of course, therefore, because this being the era, they didn't have playoff games in those days. Just whoever had the highest winning percentage won the championship.
Right.
So the Shamrocks proclaimed themselves the winners of the champions of the AFL until Homer Marshman reminded Paul Thurlow that they had agreed to play an exhibition game at the end of the season. So this then was positioned as what would be a playoff game in League Park in Cleveland. So the Rams started to promote the game as the playoff for the championship of the American Football League, and started to sell a fair amount of tickets, maybe about 15,000 tickets.
Wow.
However, there was snow in the forecast, and so the Boston Shamrocks had their own troubles back in Boston, not least of which is that their players were striking for more money, and some of them were refusing to take the train to Cleveland to play this game. So the Boston Shamrocks basically fabricated a story that there was going to be a blizzard in Cleveland and that it would probably preclude them from playing the game anyways. So they said, the game is off, and we therefore proclaim ourselves the champions of the American Football League. Well, this is, of course, Homer Marshman at this point basically said, we've had about enough of this rinky-dink league here, and that was about the time that they then said, Marshman said, I think I might be able to get us into the NFL. He had a friend in Joe F. Carr, who was then the president of the National Football League, based out of Columbus, Ohio. And that was really then what kind of, after a solitary season of the Rams in the American Football League, that's what got them entree into the NFL.
And their entree into the NFL wasn't all that smooth. Players were, they sort of had to disband the team and then redraft. So they actually started from scratch, and the league drafted the players before the team was formed. They had bids from different cities, but again, Joe Carr wanted a team in Cleveland. Tell me about that process, how they lost their players. And here they were a decent team, and they basically had to start from scratch.
Yeah, that's right. And by the way, that's a point of contention to some degree among football historians as to whether were the Rams truly founded in 1936 or were the Rams truly founded in 1937. The NFL, of course, will say that it was 1937 because that was when they started up as an almost completely different team. I maintain, and hence it's in the subtitle of my book, the NFL champs who left too soon, 1936 to 1945, because to me that was really when the franchise started up, and Joe Horgan, who's the lead historian at the Pro Football Hall of Fame, made a distinction there, and he said, there's a difference between a franchise and a team, and it's, from my perspective, the franchise was Homer Marshman, who stayed the owner as it went over to the NFL. It was Buzz Wetzel, who stayed over as the coach and the general manager, and his 3 players who then stayed with the team, as well as the name and the city. So anyways, as a side note, I kind of see the provenance of the team really being in 1936. But you're absolutely right. What's interesting, the number of cities were bidding on that franchise, and interestingly enough, 2 of the cities that bid and lost were Houston, which was at the time about the size of Toledo, Ohio. Houston was certainly not the city that it is today, and the other city was Los Angeles. And which is hard to believe, but yes, in 1937, Los Angeles lost out to Cleveland for an NFL franchise. The main thing being there is that neither one of those cities had a Major League Baseball franchise, and the NFL very much was tagging along and kind of in the footsteps or the shadow of the NFL, which is why, of course, the Bears are named after the Cubs, and then you have the Lions and the Tigers, and they played in the same ballpark. So the NFL wanted to be associated with Major League, of the Major League city. Cleveland then was a Major League city thanks to the Indians, and so that's pretty much how they got the franchise. As you said, Joe F. Carr made the draft pick because the city had not been decided yet, so they had to conduct the NFL draft. And what I think was interesting is that today, of course, the incoming team would get the first-round draft pick. This was not the case in 1936, 1937.
Right.
The incoming team got the 10th and last pick in the draft. So as I note, the first pick was Sammy Baugh in that draft. By the time the Rams came around and Joe F. Carr picked on behalf of the Rams, he drafted a player out of Purdue named Johnny Drake, who was actually a pretty fair player in his own right. He was kind of a smash-mouth running back.
Yeah, he was decent.
Yeah. Yep. So it's by no means a bad pick. Joe F. Carr did a good favor for the Rams there. But as I talk about in the book, boy, they missed out on Sammy Baugh just because of the rules of the game then, and boy, that would have changed football history.
And there were some players that were on the Rams in the AFL, and when the Rams came to the NFL suspended those players, particularly Sid Gilman. Tell me about that.
Yeah, this gets back to the NFL. And we still see this today. I mean, it happened through the '60s with the I guess it was now called the third version of the NFL or the AFL. Was very jealous of upstart leagues.
Right.
And so they had a few players there who had the temerity, so to speak, to jump to a rival league. You had Gomer Jones, who had been a kind of a marquee lineman for Ohio State, played for the Cardinals, and then he jumped to the AFL Rams and played a year. In fact, he was kind of the star of the team. So then when the Rams then were going to move into the NFL, the AFL to the NFL, the NFL basically said basically banned them for 4 years is what they did back in those days, which is basically it was a lifetime ban because most players had pretty much a 4-year career anyways. Another player was a guy named Max Padlow who had played for the Eagles. He's also from Ohio State, and interestingly enough, he went on to play for the Cincinnati Bengals of a rival league to the NFL. Mm-hmm. And then another interesting player, the most interesting guy among all of them was, of course, Sid Gilman, who played 1 year for the startup Rams, scored the very first touchdown in the Rams' history in 1936 for the AFL Rams. But Sid Gilman played 1 year pretty much as a favor to his friend Damon Buzz Wetzel. They're all Ohio State guys, and but he really had his eye on coaching, and so which was, of course, a wise choice because after that year, Sid Gilman went wholeheartedly into college and into pro coaching, and now he's in the Hall of Fame. So, but Sid Gilman had been was also banned from the NFL for having played 1 year in a rival league.
Here's another name for you, and tell me what he had to do with the Rams, the Pittsburgh Pirates, that's the baseball Pittsburgh Pirates, the University of Oregon, the naming of the Arkansas Razorbacks, Penn State, and even Bronco Nagurski. That name is Hugo Bezdek. What qualified him to be a football coach, and why did the Rams hire him?
Interesting question. Hugo Bezdek, and he would merit a whole story unto himself, a whole book unto himself. What qualified him was really he was a college football Hall of Fame coach. He had, as you mentioned, he had coached the Arkansas Razorbacks, and as legend has it, the team was not called the Razorbacks at the time. But the Razorbacks, the Hogs were relatively known in Arkansas. Legend has it that Hugo, who was actually wasn't born in the United States, he was born in what now would be, I guess, Czechoslovakia. But he, when Arkansas had upset, I believe it might have been Louisiana State, but they when they had a huge upset victory from the back of a train when a train came back into town. He said, this team, they played like a band of wild Razorbacks, and so that really stuck. So There's a lot of debate about that, but if you look at the University of Arkansas website, they will attribute that at least in part that it was to Hugo Besdick.
Wow.
But he also went to the University of Oregon. He really spent a good bit of his career at Penn State, where interestingly enough, he was very successful as a general manager or as a athletic director and as a head football coach. But he had this kind of he's a very idealistic sort of guy, and he had an idea that with the rise of pro sports, he said, college sports really should be pure. There should not be scholarships. There should not be, any sort of painting of money in college football. And little by little, he started to sort of dismantle a lot of that infrastructure, which might sound incredibly, applicable to the modern day. But he began to dismantle some of that, the money around around Penn State. And sure enough, the team began to falter. He also, as you mentioned, he also managed the Pittsburgh Pirates for a little bit.
Yeah, how does that happen? He's got to be like the only guy that was a manager in the major leagues and a head football coach in the NFL.
I know, yeah, and I think you might be right. I think there are some assertions out there that say, that I believe. You'd have to go really far back, and you might find other examples. But yeah, it's certainly in the more modern era. You're right. He's certainly stands unique of having been a college football coach, a Major League Baseball manager, and also an NFL coach. But yeah, so he had all these accolades for all his years that he had been in sports. So, and the Rams were really looking for a name coach, and they really had two choices before him. They had a guy named Ernie Nevers and then Dick Hanley, and both those guys ended up turning the Rams down. So Bert Bell, of course, who then was the owner of the Eagles and went on to be NFL commissioner, he called up Marshman and he said, "Hey, have you considered Hugo Besdick?" And that was pretty much it. So Hugo jumped to the Cleveland Rams and was a coach for about a little bit over a year.
And his debut with the Rams was not a good one. As you would expect, an expansion team doesn't win a whole lot. Their first game, they lose 28-0 to Detroit with a quote-unquote boring 4 pass attempts. Not the way you want to attract fans. They did win their second game against the Eagles, and then they lost every other game after that. Like I said, it's not the way you want to attract fans by throwing just 4 passes. How much did that first game, that first season, affect the Rams as a whole as far as their existence in Cleveland was concerned?
Yeah, I think it probably laid a pretty bad seed, to be honest, and in fact, it led to the undoing of Hugo Besdick in Cleveland as well. You had it in 1937. Here's this Rams franchise that came out of the AFL, and they were very much passing oriented. They considered themselves razzle dazzle. I mean, they had Sid Gilman, the guy now considered the father of modern day passing game, on that team. So the owners wanted that razzle dazzle. They wanted something that was going to turn the turnstiles at Cleveland Stadium. So here comes Hugo Besdick, who, as I said, this is a man who is known to have his own mind and perhaps even an anti-authoritarian streak. So he has begun to the idea that he's going to come out, he's going to establish the ground game before he establishes the passing game. He's going to play fundamental football. Mm-hmm. So you're absolutely right. An incredible 4 pass attempts the entire game. Which even at the time was a little unusual, even in 1937.
Right.
So yeah, I think it definitely took the wind out of the sails. Here's Cleveland finally with what they think is going to be a franchise forever. They think this is going to be to Cleveland what the Packers are to Green Bay or what the Bears are to Chicago. Before the game, they have a parade. They lower the lights in Cleveland Stadium to introduce the players. But then that said, the Lions were a pretty solid team then as well. They lost 28-0 to the Lions, and the Lions had just won an NFL championship just a few years earlier. So it wasn't entirely surprising, but yeah, just the style of play and being shut out, and then it even started to rain and misting rain about midway through the game, so the field is muddy, and it certainly was not an auspicious debut by any means.
And like you said earlier, there's mistrust between the fans and this team. For the first 5 games, they played 5 games at home that first season. They averaged just 8,900 fans a game, and most of the 44,500 that turned out over the course of the entire season were there for the first game. How disappointed was management with attendance, and what did that mean long-term for the Rams?
Yeah, it's a good point, and certainly they had higher aspirations for that. One thing, a little bit of caveat in that first game is that there were people there from Detroit as well. Back in those days, there was a kind of a lake ferry that kind of took people immediately, directly from Detroit to Cleveland. So there were some Detroit fans there, but you're right. When you're down to 9,000 fans a game, there were a few other teams that had attendance that was nearly as bad. The Chicago Cardinals were no great draw either, nor, interestingly enough, were the Philadelphia Eagles. So the Rams certainly were down in the bottom there, and you're right, and that unfortunately started a pattern there. And as I mentioned, it was pretty well established then. You needed to win to get attendance, but you needed attendance to generate the money to win. Those owners knew as they came out of 37, they're like, in 1938, we have got to start winning, or else this team is going to be, it's going to be threatened here.
And the league wanted the Rams to succeed. They wanted a team in Cleveland. How much pressure was management facing, knowing that the league had failed in Cleveland previously, and they really wanted a team to succeed in Cleveland?
Yeah, I think a lot of pressure. I think people don't realize, but Cleveland was a charter franchise city in the NFL in 1920. In fact, if you look at, I think Ohio had 6 cities that were of the 14 original charter franchises.
Right.
So there's a team. Yeah, so there's a team called the Tigers, and they lasted a couple of years, and then we had the Bulldogs. In 1924, they won the NFL championship. They're actually the third team in Cleveland that won the NFL championship, other than the Rams and the Browns. They were kind of an amalgamation of the Cleveland Tigers and the legendary Canton Bulldogs. But then ultimately they sort of failed, and then they had a team called the Indians. Believe it or not, this gets back to the NFL being in the shadow of Major League Baseball. That team was put in Cleveland in 1931 directly by the NFL. They literally, it was a league owned and league operated franchise. That was how desperate they were to get something going in Cleveland. The feeling really being that Cleveland was a fairly big city then. It was I think the 6th largest city in the country then, and it had and it was a well-known football area. I mean, Western Pennsylvania, Eastern Ohio is football territory
Right.
here, and it still is to this day. College football, high school football, pro football. And Joe F. Carr was right. Here he was a Columbus native, and by the way, the NFL was headquartered in Columbus, Ohio, then as well. And he was right that a team was going to take off one day. Pro football was going to catch fire in Cleveland, and he was doing his damnedest to make sure that was going to happen. But so yeah, it was pressure for sure. When you have the league itself saying that they're ponying up money to make sure that this franchise is going to take off, and it's getting off on the wrong foot, that was not sending a good signal.
And ultimately, I guess throughout their time in Cleveland, they bounced back and forth between a couple of stadiums. And when they finally decided to call Cleveland Stadium home, they found what teams before them and after them found. It was a big stadium to play in. It was a cold stadium to play in. It was on Lake Erie. And if you don't sell it out, it can feel awfully empty in there. What kind of effect did playing in Cleveland Stadium have on the team? And the field, it was also far away from the stands too. In fact, attendance was always a challenge for the Cleveland Rams. Why? And how much of that was or can be attributed to Cleveland Stadium?
That's a good question. In League Park, interestingly enough, and as you say, the Rams bounced back and forth between League Park and Cleveland Stadium, as incidentally, so did the Cleveland Indians. It was almost like they're toggling back and forth. It was almost like they were trying to find the Goldilocks Stadium here. It was like League Park just a little too small at 23,000, Cleveland Stadium monstrously big at 78,000. So, but interestingly enough, League Park was really, in many respects, kind of an optimal venue for football. It was because it was hemmed in by a city block in a city neighborhood. It had a rectangular shape to it. But yeah, Cleveland Stadium. I mean, the city had spent millions on the stadium, and they were gung ho that one way or another they're going to get the value out of that stadium. And actually, Dan Reeves, when he bought the team, that he had an eye to that too. I mean, he saw the potential here. Dan Reeves, about 10 years earlier, had been in the LA Coliseum, interestingly enough, and, in a 100,000 seat venue, and just said, wow, this is the big time. And so that was one thing that did keep him in Cleveland, is having that 78,000 seat stadium down on the lakefront. Now, I personally remember, the stadium was torn down 22 years ago. I was in many games at Cleveland Stadium for both the Browns and the Indians. And people get a little nostalgic in Cleveland for the stadium, but it was not a great place to be. In the wintertime, it was cold, it was wet, it was damp. It was, the field was, the whole stadium, was built in a landfill. And so the field would actually sink a little bit. And, there would be water, in the tunnels. The field would just be torn up. So you're right. It certainly didn't contribute to the Rams product. And as you said, it felt awfully empty. It was just so monstrous. They would take the gridiron and they would try to move it around the stadium. They would, at one point, the Rams owners came in, the original Rams owners came in and moved it down towards sort of the southwest part of the stadium, towards one enclosed area. And then when Dan Reeves came in, he kind of moved up to the northeast corner of to an enclosed area. It's like they just tried to, trying to find where was the optimal place to kind of stick this field in the stadium. And they just never really found it. So there really was never a great place other than maybe the bleachers, which is, the infamous dog pound. That was about the best place to watch a game in that stadium. So.
All right, let's talk about the product on the field for a moment. Could you imagine Bill Belichick, Bill Parcells, Bill Walsh, 3 Bills, look at that, Chuck Noll, Don Shula, Weeb Ewbank, any great coach, any coach in the league for that matter today, could you imagine them having to face the downtown coaches after every game was played? Who were they, and what kind of effect did they have on the team, particularly the coaching staff of the team?
Yeah, the downtown coaches, and that phrase was given to them by a sports writer in Cleveland. Downtown coaches were that whole collection of owners, as I mentioned. By 1940 and 1941, there were about 40 people who had a share of the Rams, and nary a one of them had other than I think Hugo Besdick and Buzz Wetzel, and actually Buzz Wetzel was the one who actually played a couple of games as an NFL player. But beyond them, nary one of them ever played a single NFL game. But they were convinced, these lawyers, these businessmen involved in racetracks, many of them, they were convinced that they knew the game better than the coaches that they hired. So they were perpetually looking over the coaches' shoulders. And in fact, at one point, it was even went so far as to where one of them, actually the president of the team, actually sat on the bench during one of the games and gave instructions to Hugo Besdick as to player substitutions and play calling.
I can't even imagine.
Right. I think it came up a couple of years ago. I think when the Browns had happened, where the GM was texting instructions down to the field to one of the coaches, and it was kind of a throwback. It was interesting. I blogged about it a little bit, just the historical parallelism there. But yeah, it was really, those downtown coaches really just sent that franchise into sort of a tizzy, and to the point where about half the team was backing Hugo Besdick, and another half was backing another one of the coaches, and so now you have a relatively young team, and they're beginning to, the loyalties are fracturing here. And it's just really a bad way to kind of run a franchise. And actually, after the downtown coaches sold the team, they even acknowledged that they had run it pretty much as a diversion or a hobby. In fact, they even one of them called a weekly social event. And so when Dan Reeves came in, that was the end of that. He was bringing a far more professional sort of demeanor to owning a team.
And they ultimately sell the team. They sell it to Dan Reeves. And from that point forward, it really was only a matter of time, as you had mentioned earlier, that this team would move. Heck, they even suspended operations in 1943 because of the war. And in retrospect, Reeves admitted how huge a mistake that was. Tell me about his decisions to suspend the team, to withdraw from the league for the 1 year, how it affected the few fans he had, and overall, again, why was this Cleveland team continually ignored by Clevelanders? And I guess the other thing is, by suspending operations for that 1 year, it was almost as if this team had to start from scratch again.
Yeah, that was an interesting decision that Dan Reeves made, and in hindsight, I mean, it made a little bit of sense in the fact that it was the depths of the war. The Indians were, as I mentioned, were the premier franchise in town, and their attendance was down from I think in 1942 or 1943, I believe it was down about 200,000, and in no small part because their big star Bob Feller was in the Navy. So Dan Reeves was about 30 years old at the time, 31, early 30s, a little bit of a maverick, and a little bit, honestly, of an outcast among the NFL owners. His son kind of confirmed that to me when I interviewed him, that his father always felt he was a little bit outside of the inner circle. Most of those other NFL owners at the time, and we're talking Hallis and Mara and Rooney and those guys. I mean, those guys were kind of salt of the earth types, and they had survived the Depression. I mean, they were, if those guys could keep the NFL going during the Depression, there was no way that World War II was going to stop their league. But Dan Reeves didn't quite read it that way, so he made the first announcement. I'm going to suspend operations for the duration of the war, fully expecting the rest of the owners to line up right behind him, which of course they did not. They summarily ignored it. So okay, fine, we're going to continue operating. And in fact, some of them, even a few of the people at some of the other teams, even made some sort of insinuations as to Reeves was doing this because he knew he was up against kind of a bad situation here financially. He was kind of punting, so to speak, because he just knew he wasn't able to compete at the time. But yeah, he immediately realized he'd made a huge mistake because, as I say, the NFL kept going on. His star players were sort of that he had mothballed, so to speak, ended up being kind of farmed out to various teams, and so yeah, he then within just a couple of months came back and said he wanted back into the league, and the league did not make it very easy for him to get back in.
No, they didn't. They had to make some concessions, and they talked about possible mergers with other teams as well. But the one thing they did do when they did come back in 44, they had a great draft. And it included a future Hall of Famer by the name of Bob Waterfield. Who were some of the other players drafted by the Rams that year? Who were some of their stars?
Well, as you got into 1944, you really started to see the gelling of a team that was about to win the NFL championship in 1945, even though it came as a bit of a surprise. You had an end who was Jim Benton. Here's a guy who is, if it were not for Don Hudson, this guy Jim Benton may well be in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Just a prototype of a modern day pass catcher, and he had been on the Rams through the war, and then actually was never called into the war because he had a heart murmur and he also had children. So in those days, of course, they weren't drafted. Another great player, Riley Rattlesnake Matheson, just a fantastic lineman, was on the team at that point. And then the Rams began to collect players who had been on the team and had gone off the war. One of them was Jim Gillette, who ended up being a star in the 1945 championship game. Jim had actually played for the Rams in the early 40s, and as I mentioned, went off to the war. Went into the Navy and was on Merchant Marines in the North Atlantic, and ultimately his son, by the way, played in the NFL in the 1970s. Then we had Fred Gurkey, who's in the Hall of Fame for his own his own sort of unique contributions, and so he came to the team. We had a guy named Steve Pritko who played who came to the Rams and played for the Giants. So you're starting to get these players who are really forming the nucleus, and then you have a few more players who just played a year or two with the Rams, and then they end up jumping to the Browns. You had Don Greenwood, you had Chet Adams, you had Galen Smith. So a really good team, as you said. Yeah, they kind of came out of nowhere. They snuck up on people. 1945, when the Rams won the championship, their PR guy said, Nate Wallach, he said people thought the Rams were not going to be contenders. He said, but they overlooked one factor, and that was Bob Waterfield,
who was just phenomenal.
Yep, absolutely.
And here they are. They finally put together a team that ultimately is going to go out and win a championship. And so they have all these good players. They have a new coach in Aldo Danelli. They finally start to turn things around. And at the same time, a new league is going to be formed, the All-American Football Conference. What kind of effect did Cleveland's entry into the AAFC have on the Rams? It wasn't a good effect.
It was not a good effect, and it was immediately the Rams are beset by questions of, well, what do you think of this up and coming team that they're talking about coming into Cleveland? And actually, the Browns would have started in 1945, but because of the war, it kind of delayed the start of the All-America Football Conference until 1946. So that would have been interesting if they had come in 45. But yeah, they came in. The AAFC, they're well funded. The Browns franchise is well funded by Mickey McBride, who was a very well-connected businessman in Cleveland, had been there for decades, had been a circulation manager at a Cleveland newspaper. He was tied into the local power structure. He owned the local taxi cab franchise. So he was a guy who was a player unto himself. And then he starts signing. He has Paul Brown as his head coach. In fact, John Dietrich, as I mentioned, of the Cleveland Plain Dealer, had recommended to Mickey McBride, who admittedly knew nothing about football. He said, "Hey, who do you think I should hire as my coach?" And John Dietrich said without hesitation, he said, Paul Brown, who had just won a national championship with Ohio State in 1942, and in fact was an Ohio boy. He come through Massillon, Ohio. And then, of course, you had you had other guys on that Browns team who were starting to get signed. Lisa, which was Otto Graham. And here was a guy playing in here is from an Illinois boy. So you have a lot of players, and I think that was the main distinction with the Browns. They were really something like half of the players in the Browns either were from Ohio or they had an Ohio connection, it seemed like a local team, whereas the Rams increasingly were seeming like a foreign team. They were running by California people, and they were sending signals that they might move, and that they. So I think almost immediately there was a kind of a gravitational pull to the Browns because people felt as if, well, this might be the real deal here,
And it's incredible because the Rams started to win. They go they start off, they're 5-1, and after a 4-game road trip, there was finally demand for tickets because they're 5-1. But instead of moving the game, they're playing at League Park, and instead of moving the game against the Green Bay Packers at Cleveland Stadium, they decide to expand League Park, and they erect temporary stands. This is a team that just can't do anything right, it seems. This is a jinx team. How crucial a blunder was that for the team's fortunes as far as staying in Cleveland? Because some of those stands collapsed, people were turned away. You talk about a bad move. This team can't do anything right. No wonder they're alienating fans.
Exactly. Yeah. In fact, John Dietrich, as I mentioned, from the Plain Dealer, he argued that was a fatal move. That was probably kind of the last blow. The Rams only played 4 games at home that season, and the first 2 weeks of the season, and nobody in Cleveland knew what this team was going to be. They just assumed it was going to be another 500 team. the last game of the season was played at Cleveland, and it was against a Boston team that was kind of a virtual non-entity at the time, and the Rams had already clinched the Western Division. So that middle game was this middle crucial game. They're playing against the Green Bay Packers, who at that point was their biggest arch rival. The Packers just dominated the Western Division in that era. Don Hudson was just a perpetual thorn in the side of the Rams. So here you have this game, as you said, huge interest. And the Rams beat the Packers. It's the first time that they've ever beaten the Packers at home. And there's just a surge of fans. 28,000 people tried to buy tickets to this game. Yeah, and League Park holds 23,000 people. So, of course, the question arises to Chili Walsh, well, of course you're going to move this game to Cleveland Stadium, right? And he said, no, I have a lease, yet again. He cited how you have a lease with League Park. So, as you say, he got this idea to erect temporary stands. And the worst part was, because it was still the war and steel was in short supply, they were wooden stands. So not long into the first quarter, the fans are pumped up. They start bouncing on the stands, and they collapse. And one guy breaks his leg, and it's chaos on the field. Fans just end up ringing around the field to watch the rest of the game. As you said, some people are turned away from the game, from the gate, because they can't fit any more people in the stadium. So yeah, here was their breakout moment in Cleveland, and as you said, it's just completely botched, and it just didn't have to be that way. Which almost, if a conspiracy thinker may question whether Chili Walsh just kind of did it out of spite or whatever, so.
And they go 9-1. They lead the league in so many different categories. They got players who set records. The Rams were finally the best team in the league. And for the 1945 championship game, Cleveland Stadium is going to play host to the game, and man, does it live up to its reputation. Thanks to nearly 2 feet of snow leading up to the game, which affected attendance, the game, it could have been called the Ice Bowl, but, since then, another game took that moniker. How awful was it? How awful was that championship game?
It was pretty awful, and unfortunately, it doesn't officially rank with the NFL as the coldest games, because they didn't have back then they didn't have the weather readings. They didn't have accurate enough weather data for historians today to rank it up there. But by all accounts, right, my father was at the game. He was only 10 at the time, but he just remembers just how incredibly cold. But as you said, typical Cleveland, and anybody who's ever lived in the Great Lakes region will know how capricious the weather can be. When the Rams clinched the Western Division and the tickets went on sale in Cleveland Stadium, immediately they sold 30,000 tickets. I mean, this looked like it was on pace to set an NFL record for what up to then was only a dozen NFL championship games.
And finally, interest in the Rams.
Yes, exactly. And so, of course, then a week before the game, it's like 50 degrees, and you're thinking this is going to be fantastic. Ticket sales are going to be great in here in December. Well, as by Monday, a huge cold front moves in. Snow just begins descending, just in sort of apocalyptic waves. The Rams get the idea to put straw on the field in order to insulate the field and keep it from freezing. Upon which then they put a tarp, upon which then, as you said, a couple feet of snow is on top of this. So they've created this sort of sandwich of a field that by game day is just it's just a total mess, because it's just snowed all week. And by the morning of game day, the temperature was about zero, as I say in the chapter in the game. It literally was 0 degrees. And as I mentioned, anybody's ever been to Cleveland Stadium at 0 degrees, I mean that might be like minus 20 in other places, just with the wind off the lake, and so it was, by all accounts, just an absolutely nasty game.
But they won it.
Absolutely, and in a very bizarre fashion.
Tell me about the game.
Okay, well, the Rams came in as 4-point favorites, and which I think some people are surprised to hear now. They were against the Washington Redskins, Sammy Baugh. But Sammy Baugh he's been a little injured. He actually only played the first quarter or so, maybe halfway into the second quarter. But of course, the pivotal play of the game is scoreless. The Rams have the Redskins backed up in their own territory, kind of on the 2-yard line, with their backs backed up to what became much later, Cleveland Stadium, the dog pound. And Sammy Baugh took the snap, and at one point was through to his right, and the wind caught the ball and just kind of dropped the ball, kind of just kind of in open territory, and he actually got an intentional grounding penalty, which backed him up even more. On the next play, he was going to, yet again, looked as if he might punt, and instead he then threw rapidly to his left, and kind of a gust of wind took the ball, took it into an upright, and it bounced off the upright and fell back into the end zone. At which point everybody stopped. There's a little bit of video out there on YouTube, actually, if you see the game, if you watch it kind of in slow motion, you can see the reaction. The ball just kind of skitters into a corner of the end zone. Everybody stops. My father, as I mentioned, was there with his father, my grandfather. He remembers that play, and he wondered why, play stopped for a couple minutes. And then they put 2 points on the board for the Rams. And what it was even then a fairly unknown or obscure rule in the NFL that if a ball hits off the crossbar or the upright and bounces back into the end zone, it's a safety.
Wow.
So the Rams are up by 2-0. And as an aside, George Preston Marshall, who is the owner of the Redskins in the off season, would be so miffed by that ruling that it would be taken off the NFL books forever. And to this day, a ball that hits the goalpost that comes back in the end zone is merely a dead ball. So that's now known as the Marshall-Baugh rule in the NFL. But that ended up being the margin in the game. The Rams ended up winning 15-14. And on 2 nice touchdown passes by Bob Waterfield, and that was pretty much a shocker to Cleveland. I think a lot of people had not anticipated that, and by that point there were about maybe 32,000 people in the stadium, very frozen, probably many of them fairly well inebriated by all accounts. Fires burning in the stadium for heat. Anybody who's familiar with Cleveland Browns games will find none of this at all surprising. My father recalls that his father had warned him to stay away from the fire at the stands because he was afraid that he might burn himself. So, yeah, just a totally night is falling on Cleveland Stadium, and you get some crazies running around. That was how the Rams won the 1945 championship.
And here it should be a time of celebration, but the upstart AAFC and the Cleveland Browns were making it anything but a time for celebration. They were threatening to sign away the Rams' best players. And 27 days later, 27 days after the Rams win the championship, bye-bye, they're gone. Incredible. They left.
Yeah, that's correct, yeah.
Yeah, they left. But it wasn't without a fight, wasn't without concessions, and it was hidden from the public because of a newspaper strike. I mean, just, again, incredible stuff.
Right. Yeah, they, as you said, was not without a fight. Yet again, here's Dan Reeves, who is, not necessarily, in the inner circle here with his fellow owners, and he pretty much says at one point when he's denied, because he's denied several times. He said, "No, you are not going to move this team to Los Angeles." The NFL at the time was very insular, and they very much wanted to stay in kind of their corner of the country. When you think about it, the NFL pretty much at that point stopped at Chicago and Green Bay, and it didn't. That was it. And so all the NFL owners could think about was the expense of having to train teams all the way out to Los Angeles. And it was. In those days, it was expensive. It's a long way to go. Dan Reeves, is part of his argument with the owners. He says, he basically says, "Hey, now come on. Los Angeles is only a 45-hour train ride from Chicago. What are you guys making such a big deal about this for?" So, which is funny because it's 2 days out there, 2 days back. So, I mean, the owners had a case, and as I said, it was, today would be almost like the NFL having, I think, a franchise in Asia. So it'd be like, okay, so all these teams have to jet all the way to Asia to play their games. But yeah, it's not without many arguments, but Dan Reeves gets his way when he basically tells the other owners, he says, fine, then the Rams are out of the NFL. So because of, as you mentioned, the AAFC is already lurking here because they have already announced they're putting a team in San Francisco called the 49ers. They're putting a team in Los Angeles called the Dons. And so Dan Reeves plays at his advantage, and he says, hey, we're going to lose. California is going to be a huge market. It already is a huge market. LA already was the 5th largest city. He said, we're going to lose out to the All-America Football Conference. We need to get a stake in the ground in California. And that was pretty much how he convinced the other owners to give him permission. Although that said, the NFL owners did not do it without hedging a little bit. They told him, they said, okay, fine, if you can move, but you need to have a stadium in Los Angeles within 90 days, and if you don't, the team will be moved to Cincinnati, which I thought was interesting. So, there was the briefest of moments there, the outside possibility that it might have been the Cincinnati Rams, but sure enough. Reeves, even though he had already had a backup plan to play in a couple other little baseball stadiums, one called Gilmore Stadium and one called Wrigley Field, believe it or not, he had backup plans, but really he had set his sights on that huge 100,000 seat LA Coliseum, and he was determined he was going to get into it.
And it wasn't easy for him. Like you said, he was determined he was going to get into it, and I think he probably thought it'd be pretty easy to get into that stadium, but it wasn't.
Right. Yeah, it was the LA Coliseum had been off limits to the NFL for probably, I think at that point, 20 years. And in part it was because, yet again, we're talking about, the jealousy among sports here. It was the home field for USC. And once the NFL started to play some games there in the mid-20s, USC basically saw this as competition. So they had banished NFL games for 20 years there. And so Dan Reeves thought, well, of course, I'm bringing a championship NFL team here. They'll open their arms wide and welcome us to the LA Coliseum. But of course, it didn't turn out that way. And what Reeves had not anticipated, and in particular Chili Walsh, who now is out there and he's negotiating on behalf of the Rams franchise, shows up at a hearing of the LA Coliseum Commission. And what he doesn't know is that there are going to be 3 African-American sports writers who are going to be at the hearing to hear whether or not the Rams should get access to the Coliseum. And these 3 African-American players have taken it upon themselves to use this as an opportunity to begin to reintegrate the NFL. The NFL has not had African-American players since 1932 due to the Depression. There was a concern among the NFL owners that they might be giving jobs to African Americans rather than whites. So there's this sort of like this undercurrent of racism here and a lack of integration. So these African American sports writers stand up basically at the hearing, and they use an argument. They actually cite a Supreme Court ruling, which is then in effect, which is we now remember as separate but equal. And basically they said, okay, if the LA Coliseum is going to be the home of the white team, then where is the stadium in Los Angeles that's going to be home for the black team?
Wow.
And of course, Los Angeles did not want this controversy. Los Angeles was welcoming. They wanted to get professional sports, Major League Sports out to their city, which of course they ended up doing in on many counts. They did not want this controversy whatsoever, and they turned pretty much to Chili Walsh and they said, well, would you consider integrating the team and hiring an African American player? And Chili Walsh said, sure, absolutely. Not necessarily knowing whether or not he would be held to that, but of course they did. Those activists in LA did hold him to that, and that was how the Rams got into the Coliseum.
And to add salt to the wound, a few of the Rams decide to stay in Cleveland and play for the newly formed Browns, who drew record crowds of more than 60,000 people in Cleveland Stadium. Cleveland proved it could support a football team. They didn't want to support the Rams, but they had no problem supporting the Browns. And then the Browns go on to win the only championships the AAFC ever had before ultimately joining the NFL. And in 1950, they beat, lo and behold, the Los Angeles Rams for the NFL title. How ironic is that? And what sweet revenge for the fans of Cleveland football to beat the team that abandoned them.
Absolutely. And it was a tight game too, and the Rams came back to Cleveland, and there was no love lost there. As you mentioned, there had been a lawsuit there. Several of the players on the Rams, when Dan Reeves announced he was moving the team to Los Angeles, we have to think back to players in those days. They weren't paid that much, and many of them had, most of them had off-season jobs. So several of the players basically said, I'm not moving to Los Angeles. There's nothing that would be, there's nothing for me there. When I signed up to play with this team, I signed with the Cleveland Rams. I did not sign with the Los Angeles Rams.
Right.
So Dan Reeves prevailed upon him just legally that it compelled them to move to Los Angeles, and it went all the way to a district judge who ruled against Dan Reeves, which I since talked with a family friend who is an attorney, and he's amazed that would actually happen, that Reeves would lose that particular case, because to him it seemed like it would be a pretty open and shut case. But for whatever reason, Dan Reeves is ruled against, and those players are allowed to continue on and stay in Cleveland, and they play for the Browns. So they had Chet Adams and Galen Smith then joined the Browns. And so you had in that 1946, you had several players who had been with the Rams and had been with the Browns. In fact, Don Greenwood won a championship in 1945 with the Rams, 1946 with the Browns, and 1947 with the Browns, and then he retired. So there's another kind of interesting statistic. I don't know how many players have played 3 years, won championships in all three, and then retired.
That's
crazy. But that's Don Greenwood.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome. So the Browns beat the Rams in 50, but then the Rams come back and beat the Browns for the title in 51, and then the Rams wouldn't win again until they were in St. Louis, thus the 3 championships in 3 cities for the Rams. The Browns came back in 52 to beat the Rams. Cleveland, by that time, was truly Title Town. Again, a name taken by another city. I could go on forever, and I believe we've only scratched the surface of the entire Cleveland Rams story. And I want to end it here. As you had mentioned, it went to the courts, and the ruling was, for all intents and purposes, the Rams ceased to exist. Some players from the Rams refused to follow the team to Los Angeles, as you had said, such as Galen Smith and Chet Adams. How apropos, though, was that ruling that this team ceased to exist? I find that wording very funny.
Yeah, I agree with that. And you have that flash of 10 years, and you're absolutely right. They became a completely different team. Once they may have moved to Los Angeles, but it was almost as if they left something behind, because when they went out to Los Angeles, it was just a completely different franchise. They became Hollywood's team. They had shed an identity. It was, I always think of just somebody taking, just a kind of an ordinary Joe in Ohio and going to LA, and falling into the Hollywood crowd or something. That's exactly what the Rams were. It was almost like they had just transmogrified or transformed into an entirely different identity. And the Cleveland Rams, yes, absolutely. That day they ceased to exist, and to some extent, interestingly enough, they ceased to exist to many people in Cleveland, which is one reason why I wrote the book. It's remarkable. Much of the team's history was lost in Cleveland, even within a few decades. The Browns so occluded everything that the Rams had done in Cleveland that it's really kind of a shame that the Rams' history has been lost. To so many people.
Like I said, I think we've only scratched the surface. I could talk so much more, I'm sure you can, about the Cleveland Rams. Jim, I can't thank you enough for joining me today on Sports Forgotten Heroes, the Cleveland Rams. What a great topic. What a great story. Say, how can people get a hold of your book?
They could go to McFarland Books would probably be the best way. That's the publisher. The other way, too, if you'd like to order just directly off my website, it's clerams.com. And if you buy it through my site, even, I'd be happy to sign the book as well and ship it off to you. So however you want to do it. It's also on Amazon, so any online book retailers as well.
Awesome. Hey, would you consider coming back again?
I absolutely would. Be happy to, Warren.
Awesome. Jim, thanks again so much for joining me on Sports Forgotten Heroes. Great show.
Thank you, Warren. Good talking to you.
In his book and on today's podcast, Jim spoke about how the NFL wanted a successful team in Cleveland. And they tried several times. The first team in Cleveland was the Tigers, and they were followed by the Indians, a team that only played on the road. Then along came the Bulldogs, and they were led by quarterback Benny Friedman, who, incidentally, was the subject of Sports Forgotten Heroes episode number 12. The Bulldogs were followed by a second version of the Indians, and then along came the Rams. The Browns actually got their start in the AAFC, the All-American Football Conference, which ultimately folded, and some of their teams, including the Browns, were absorbed by the NFL. The Browns hung around until 1995 before moving on to Baltimore. Cleveland, however, was able to keep all of the Browns' records, and the team was reborn in 1999. As for the Rams, 1937, their first NFL campaign, they went 1-10. And followed that by going 4-7 in 1938. They finally reached 500 by going 5-5-1 in 1939. They fell back to 4-6-1 in 1940, followed by seasons of 2-9 and 5-6. They didn't play in 1943, then went 4-6 in 1944, and finally 9-1 in 1945 and won the NFL championship. 27 days later, they relocated to Los Angeles. In 1949, the Rams lost to the Eagles in the NFL Championship. Then they lost to the Browns in the 1950 title game, beat the Browns in the 1951 championship, and then lost the title again to Cleveland in 1955. The Rams' road to Los Angeles has been a long one. After leaving Cleveland, they called LA home through the 1994 season, then moved to St. Louis and called it home from 1995 through 2015, before once again relocating to Los Angeles for the 2016 season. Overall, the Rams have won 15 division titles, 6 conference titles, and 3 overall championships. Next time on Sports Forgotten Heroes, the controversial story of one of the most fascinating players in soccer, or football, Justin Fashanu. A story about a striker who had such a terrific career ahead of him, but ended very tragically. For more on Sports Forgotten Heroes, please visit sportsfh.com. Thank you again to today's guest, Jim Sulecki, and see you next time on Sports Forgotten Heroes.
We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday's Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.